Hollingshead, Arwaski,
Here.
Vindicke,
Here.
Look,
Here.
Melichnik,
Here.
McDonald, Buin,
Here.
McGuire,
Here.
Narayanan,
Here.
Dietrich,
Here.
Reich,
Present.
Sanger, Schember, Stephenson, Woodson, Tolbert,
Here.
Ulrich,
Here.
Windschittle,
Here.
and Washi.
Here.
I don't believe I was called. Go tell. I'm here.
You were called.
Did-
No.
Oh, sorry.
And Schember,
It's-
I might have missed it, Schember.
I'll mark you as well.
Yep. I thought I heard her call your name too, George. All right. Very good. Thanks. We've got an agenda approved. We've got reports here to take care of. We just had a exec committee meeting. I allowed an hour and a half for it to talk about all these funding scenarios, and we hardly scratched the surface. So I'm hoping we don't break the all-time tab time record today on this first go around of discussing these regional solicitation funding scenarios. So just a quick comment on that issue. So what we're going to be doing, I think primarily today, is spending our time on the regional solicitation that's upcoming. The regional solicitation, of course, deals with these projects that are 4 to 5 years out. The assumption based on historical monies coming down to the region is that we've got about $200 million to work with. There is the possibility of also doing some over-programming at 10%, which is a safe over-programming number based upon what we've seen in terms of projects failing to get done in the past that were scheduled to be done or selected for being done. So that would add another $20 million to the funding scenarios that we'll look at. So if we over-program, as I said, we'd have another $20 million to spend approximately based on the assumptions that we've had in the past. So I think we do have the ability to probably safely over-program. We started this process with 5 funding scenarios, 5 different standards, if you will, or possibilities that the tab gave direction to staff on. We now have 6 funding scenarios, and so our goal today, hopefully, is to get down to 3 or 4, because those have enough complications, because we've typically ended up with hybrids out of the 3 or 4 we worked from in the past. So we have 6 funding scenarios now because TAC requested a regional funding scenario based upon their perceived need for more freight mobility and safety aspects. The thing that you'll discover about that funding, potential funding scenario, is that it requires the shift. You remember last solicitation, we shifted $5 million out of roadways into transit, $4 million, and bike ped $1 million. That would require, under that 6th scenario, that we go back, shift that money back into roadways again. So that's something that we'll be talking about today as well. I'm not going to say any more about the regional funding scenarios right now. The other thing I wanted to quickly cover were equity. In November, we'll be having a community conversation on equity. I'm going to try to find someone, along with staff, that can effectively lead that conversation, possibly from the Citizens League or someone that's been with the Citizens League in the past. And then finally, with respect to the executive committee, it's that time of the year again to think about populating the exec committee. So between now and the end of December, if folks can let me know if you're interested in serving on the exec committee, and I'll go back through that composition again. The board chair, which is a person selected by the chair of the Met Council, and then we've got some agency representatives, of course, one from Mndot, one from the Met Council. We've got 2 members representing the county boards. We've had a lot of interest in those spots in the past. We've got one member representing the board members from the cities of the first class. That's Kevin Reich, who represents the cities of the first class, Minneapolis and St. Paul. Two members representing the board members from the remaining cities. So if you're a member from one of the other remaining cities, let us know. And then we've had traditionally one member representing the citizen representatives as part of the exec committee team. And then finally, one member representing the modal and remaining agency board members. So those are the folks that populate that executive committee. And that's what I have for my report, for the chair's report for today. Mike Barnes, anything to report on Mndot?
Just a couple of short things here. As we can see, we got the beginning of our snow season started a little earlier than we were hoping, but we had crews out with that. I know there's questions about some of the projects. Overall, the majority of our projects were wrapping up, so it was mostly just striping, but we do have a couple of projects that still had about a week or 35 or week of concrete paving yet, so that's a concern that we're trying to work through. But overall, that's the 35W North, the Min-Pass project, and then our 94 on the west side of the metro. The airport one, that's just some striping that's left. So overall, the construction season was good, but I don't think we all anticipated to get the blizzard here in the middle of October's. But other than that, we're trying to get it wrapped up. So I don't know if there's questions.
All right, any questions for Member Barnes? The
All right,
project around the airport, that's still ahead of schedule?
Well, it's wrapping up. It's just on the striping
good.
side of it. So.
All right, great. Good news. All right, is Todd Bewan with us?
Yes, I am, Mr. Chair. I don't really have much today. Just our primary representative on the tab, Craig McDonald, who's been pulled away for the last 7 months by the governor's office and Minnesota Management and Budget to work on COVID response, is coming back to the agency this week. So you may see him back here over the next couple of months. So I just wanted to let you know that he's happy to be back with us, and he may be joining you in future meetings.
All right, thanks, Member Bewan. Well, it's always good to have you with us. And then Carl Crimmins.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm here to report international airline flights are down 95%. Domestic flights are down 41%, and that's an improvement to 41%. Passenger levels are down 61%. And then in October, the second week of October, we had 93,000 passengers. In 19, we had 270,000 passengers. So that's only 34% of the 19 level. Staff is still working on relief for the airlines, for the concessionaires, and for the vendors at the airport. We've deferred rent payments through May, June, and July, and now we've kicked it up to the end of the year. So rent payments and lower rates are being deferred till December. The inbound roadway, speaking of road projects, the inbound roadway is half finished, and we decided it was a good time to do this work, rip out the old inbound roadway and put in concrete, which will last, it looks like about a 20-year cycle. So that's half done. And then they're working on parking, the rate of parking reductions. There's been a proposal to reduce parking rates from $26 a day to $19 a day. And that will be for certain weekends, holidays, and for 7 days or more consecutive parking. And that proposal is being reviewed by the Finance Committee, and there'll be an announcement about that in the near future. And that's all I have at this time, Mr. Chair.
All right. Have you heard anything relative to another bill out of Congress that might be beneficial to the airlines or to your operations?
Yes, sir. Well, they're still working on that. That's that stimulus package that would include the airlines. Some people wanted to go a separate bill for the airlines, and we don't think that's going to happen, but who knows what's going to happen, really. But we still have CARES money. We're not spending CARES money on any concessionaires or rent relief. It's mostly for operating the airport. And we think that CARES money we received the first go around should be good for another year yet to help offset some of our losses. And if something else comes forward, we would naturally put that aside and use that for airport related activities.
Boy, that sounds like really a solid fiscal work on your part.
Well, the staff is really working pretty hard at this stuff, trying to figure out relief, rent relief, leasing reliefs, airport reliefs, airlines. You know, it's just everybody needs a little hand, and so we're doing that. And oh, I forgot to mention, we did as a commission, we passed a $15 an hour minimum wage at the airport starting January 1st. So we put that in, so we're now comparable with St. Paul, Minneapolis, as far as workers they're on the same schedule as Minneapolis, going with the $15 an hour.
I noticed that on the news yesterday. That was a good piece of work as well. So, any questions for Member Crimmins, MAC related? Yes.
Yes.
Commissioner McGuire.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On that last point, Carl, I missed the details of it. Is that just for airport employees, or are you requiring that of all your vendors and everything? I was just curious when you say the minimum wage. Does everyone have to abide by that?
It's going to be if you work at the airport a certain number of hours in a week, then it applies to you. So it's the same as the Minneapolis. We took the Minneapolis package. We didn't want to reinvent the wheel, so we took Minneapolis language and adopted. So we're on the same schedule of pay and everything. But if you work at the airport, if you're a vendor working at the airport certain hours of the week, so many hours a week, then you're eligible for the $15 an hour.
Wow, great. Okay, thank you. Thank you. That's good.
Okay, great. Anything else for Member Crimmins? All right, Member Barber, anything to report from the Met Council standpoint?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mostly good news today. So we have, as we all know, the bonding bill passed, and something very exciting. We now have our funding for the B and D line. Now we've had some conversations amongst this group and Transportation Committee that in delaying that would have delayed the D line. That is no longer the case. The D line will move on schedule. So we're very excited. Really want to thank all of my fellow TAB members for your support of those projects. They're very important for the region, so thank you to you all. Also, we have the Met Council has recently awarded $4.5 million in grants for transit-oriented development in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and St. Louis Park. The grant awards will make it possible for people to live near transit. That'll get them to jobs, schools, appointments, shopping, other destinations. The 3 grant awards will help create 332 homes for families and individuals, with most of them being affordable to households with an annual income at or below 60% of area median income. So very nice to see that. As you know, we did expand our transit service. It's still not back up to pre-COVID levels, but so far the expansion has been running smoothly since we did that in mid-September. We continue to provide service that allows for social distancing, even on the busiest routes. Mass compliance has been very good, and our workforce has been able to provide all of the services to date. Based on our research about COVID and transportation systems and guidance from CDC and Minnesota Department of Health, with our new protocols for operations, our operations and cleaning, customers can be confident that transit service is safe in our region, and I think we've been able to demonstrate that and found a way to successfully in the current environment. We are really focusing a lot of our efforts and a lot of our service on local and local supporting routes, because we're finding things like the C line and A line did not drop off as much as other routes of transit. So that is really, as we're kind of bringing back some of the expansion, we're focusing there without bringing back as much for the commuter services right now, which just is, given what we're seeing with our ridership, makes the most sense. So with that, take any questions.
All right. Questions for Member Barber? All right. Thank you. Thanks for that update.
Okay.
And then Chair Freeze from the TAC, anything to report now, or do you want to hold until we take on these other items?
I have no report.
All right, thank you. We've got minutes from September 16th, 2020 to deal with. Is there anyone who cares to make a motion to approve those minutes from September 16th?
Mr. Chair, I will move that we approve the minutes
Thank you.
Wind shuttle seconds.
Heeman, Roland.
All right. All right. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Mayor. All right, we got a motion and a second on the approval of the minutes for September 16, 2020. Any further discussion? Roll call, please, Jenna.
Anderson,
Aye.
Bailey,
Aye.
Barber,
Aye.
Barnes,
Aye.
Boyles,
Aye.
Crimmins,
Aye.
Dugan,
Aye.
Foster,
Aye.
Fox,
Aye.
Geisler,
Aye.
Giuliani Stevens, Patel,
Aye.
Heyman Roland,
Aye.
Hanson,
Aye.
Holberg,
Aye.
Hollinshead,
Aye.
Karwoski,
Aye.
Lindeke,
Aye.
Look,
Aye.
Malichnik,
Aye.
Ewan,
Aye.
McGuire,
Aye.
Narayanan,
Aye.
Petrick,
Aye.
Reich,
Aye.
Sanger,
Aye.
Schember,
Aye.
Stephenson, Swanson, Holbert, Holbert, Ulrich,
Was the last one Tolbert? If it was, I would vote in yes.
yes, perfect.
Okay,
Thank you.
sorry.
No, you're good. Wind shuttle,
Aye.
Washi.
Aye.
All right, thank you. We've got minutes approved for September 16, 2020. In the business portion of the agenda, we've got 2 items on the consent agenda and then 1 item that requires action. Chair Freeze, in the exec committee, we had Joe handle these 2 matters. I don't know who you want to have handle them and just give a quick explanation. Or we can just move to motion, I guess. Let me ask it this way. Does anybody want to remove an item from the consent agenda? All right. Is there we've got 2 items on the consent agenda. They both involve funds other than regional solicitation funds. So one's a federal discretionary fund matter, that's 34, and 35 is a source of funds there is Mndot internal budget. And so is there a motion to adopt the items on the consent agenda in a single?
Wind shuttle moves to consent.
Hotel seconds.
All right. Any further discussion? Roll call, please, Ms. Ernst.
Anderson, Bailey,
Aye.
Barber,
Aye.
Barnes,
Aye.
Boyles,
Aye.
Crimmins,
Aye.
Dugan,
Aye.
Foster,
Aye.
Fox,
Aye.
Geisler,
Aye.
Patel,
Aye.
Heyman Roland, Heyman Roland,
Stepped away.
Hanson,
Aye.
Holberg,
Aye.
Hollinshead,
Aye.
Karwoski,
Aye.
Lindeke,
Aye.
Look,
Aye.
Malichnik,
Yes. Aye.
Ewan,
Aye.
McGuire,
Aye.
Narayanan,
Aye.
Petrick,
Aye.
Reich,
Aye.
Sanger,
Aye.
Schember,
Aye.
Stephenson, Swanson, Tolbert, Ulrich,
Aye.
Wind shuttle,
Aye.
Washi.
Aye.
Mr. Chair, I'm here. Came and rolling. Aye.
Got it. Thank you.
All right, the items on the consent agenda 2020-34 and 2020-35 are approved. We have one action item to discuss, and it's based upon the conversation we had last month. And Amy Venowitz has this matter, and she'll go over the changes in the TPP and the comments that were provided and how those changes are being tracked and how it affected the TPP preparation. And I think that was something that some of our members were keenly interested in, as well as having all of the changes or all the comments appended to the main document. So Ms. Venowitz, welcome, and thank you for getting quickly on your screen the overall edits being recommended.
Sorry, Mr. Chair.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. Mr. Chair and members, so the action item that is before you today is the last action relating to having you recommend adoption of the 2020 update of the Transportation Policy Plan. If you'll remember, as the chair indicated, we were in front of you last month and we summarized the public comments at a pretty high level and the major themes that came from the public comment. So just as a quick reminder, there were three major themes as part of the public comment. The first was that the region should eliminate road expansion and invest in transit and active transportation to mitigate climate change and to lower vehicle miles traveled. The second comment was that we need to better recognize our region's Black, Brown, Indigenous communities and our low-income populations, and that they are the most impacted by climate change, and that we should plan and invest to mitigate the impacts and mitigate inequalities. And then the third comment was that the TPP should promote best practices in parking policy to better influence climate change impacts and other negative effects of having lots of regional parking. So we went through those comments and we generally talked about our responses. And what we were asked to do was to come back with a specific document summarizing the changes that have been made. So there are a number of documents that are attached to the agenda today. Most of them are the chapters for the TPP update and also the overview chapter. The track changes, those documents all include track changes for the changes that we've made. But what we are showing on the screen here today is a compilation of all the changes that you would see in all the different chapters and in the overview. So this document really is the best summary of the changes that we are making in response to public comment. And so what I will do to get us through this fairly quickly and just let you ask questions is highlight some of the major changes that we made in response to public comment. So the way this is laid out is in the left column, you'll see a page number. The middle column is a description of where we have made the change on that page. And then the right column is the actual change that is being made within the documents. So the first couple pages of this document are in the overview chapter of the TPP. And the one that I will call out to your attention on this page is on page 15, where we have made a change similar to this in a lot of different locations throughout the TPP. It's really language that better recognizes that when we are addressing congestion, looking for solutions to congestion, that we employ a range of strategies within the region, and that the first strategy that we use is a strategy called travel demand management, which is seeking to reduce travel, single occupant travel on our highway system, and that those strategies can relate to better land use planning, creating walkable and bikeable communities, supporting and encouraging telecommuting and the use of flexible work hours with our employers, and then investing in transit and other alternative transit travel modes. So that general language that you see here on page 15, this is one of the first places that we're incorporating it, but it is used throughout various pieces of the overview and then the highway investment chapter to really emphasize TDM is the first step in reducing congestion. And then if that is not working, then we move to what we would call roadway solutions, which would involve lower cost, high benefit spot mobility improvements, potentially implementing min-pass lanes that benefit transit and carpools. And then our final solution, really the last solution on the continuum of solutions, is looking at different types of capacity expansion. So we're trying to emphasize that capacity expansion is the last solution that we should go to address congestion. So moving on from there, if we scroll to the next major comment, I'm going to point out part of our response related to highway expansion too is that oftentimes we need to remember that our funding for highways and transit is not flexible, and we can't necessarily take highway funds and move them to transit or bike and ped investments. So we are adding language in a number of locations, one of the first ones being here on page 29, to emphasize that our funding is not very flexible, that most of it is dedicated by the state constitution or federal or state law for a specific mode, and that we cannot necessarily flex those funds from one mode to another. So that is page 29. From there, I will move to a change on page 38. So part of our response, particularly to the general theme that we need to recognize and have more equitable transportation investments within the region. So we are adding a new work program chapter, or a new work program item to the work program chapter. And this one is specifically dealing with an evaluation of equity in our regional transportation investment processes. So we hope to begin this equity project in 2021. It will take an equity lens and really evaluate how we plan, program, and fund transportation within the region, and then come up with recommendations for making our processes more equitable. And on page 38, this is in the overview, so it really is just referencing the work program chapter. And then if you move forward again, Greg, to the work program chapter itself, you can see he's scrolling through edits that we have made in various chapters here. And so in the work program chapter, we've made some of our bigger edits. As I just said, we added the new work program item for the equity evaluation. What he's shown on the screen here is we've added in some new language talking about work that we will be doing in the area of planning for climate change. We do have 2 projects that were already in the TPP relating to vehicle electrification and accelerating that within the region, and then also developing a climate change scenario planning tool. Those 2 work program items are still in the TPP, and this is introductory language, just really talking about the importance of mitigating climate change impacts within the transportation industry. And then if you scroll a little bit more there, Greg, the last major change I will point out here is also in the work program, and we are adding a study specifically related to travel demand management. And this new study will be a regional plan and priorities of strategies that we should be implementing within the region related to travel demand management. We last did a TDM plan, I believe, in 2010, and so this is somewhat of an update of that plan, but it will specifically prioritize strategies that we can and should be implementing and help us get to a further implementation. So those are really the major specific changes I was going to go over today. I can answer any questions related to the TPP in general or to the changes that we've made. And then if you're in agreement, we'll move to recommending adoption of the 2020 update to the TPP.
All right, good, thank you, Ms. Benowitz. Are there questions for Ms. Benowitz?
Yes, I have a question.
Yes, Ms. Hanger.
Okay,
Member
actually,
Hanger.
thank you, Chair. I have two questions. First of all, it's comment on, I think it's page 29, but it's also referenced elsewhere. We had many commenters, public commenters, who talked about their requests that money be moved from the roadway expansion category to transit. And I think you appropriately acknowledge you can't move that money the way they had requested, but I think it would also be appropriate to point out that we could consider moving the lane expansion money from lane expansion to other categories within roadways, like, you know, improved safety or improved mobility for roadways. So to acknowledge that there is some flexibility there. And the second comment I would make is on page, I think it's 38, where you talk about the equity study, which I'm glad you're doing. I've just question for you is, will it also include looking at equity for disabled members of our community?
Mr. Chair and Member Sanger, your first question related to the flexibility of the roadway funding, I'll have to think about that a little. So the roadway funding that you're speaking to is our Mndot funds, and they are allocated to us specifically from Mndot. So when they come to us as a region, they are specifically for regional mobility. If we declined to have any regional mobility projects, the funds would go back to Mndot, and the decision making for where those funds would be spent would be up to Mndot. We could suggest putting them into safety, regional safety, or preservation, but I think I noted at another meeting, Mndot could make the decision not even to spend them within the region. They could end up going to greater Minnesota. So that decision-making process is not necessarily something that we would control, though the TPP can emphasize what we prioritize for spending.
Okay.
And then your second question related to the equity study, it will not be dealing with disabled or ADA. It's specifically a study related to racial inequity within our region. And I'm not trying to downplay or say that the others are not important, but in this instance, we're going to limit it to racial inequities.
Thank you.
Other questions for Ms. Benowitz?
Mr. Chair, Mark Windschuttle.
Yes, Mayor.
So, and this is more of a, I think, just an overall comment. And I know that this document changes regularly, but what do we see, or what going to be the process, or as we see COVID just keeps to be stretching out further and further into the future, what does this do to a lot of this plan? Does it, I mean, do we look at, you know, about people working at home, not coming, maybe not as many going to offices anymore? Where do we hit the pause button, and do we start looking at something like that maybe the commutes reverse and change? How? And I know that there's so much of this is unknown, but I guess it's more of a comment to put out there to say, when do we start really starting to say things are going to change and drastic changes?
Sure. So, Mr. Chair and members, one thing I'll remind you of, so one of the reasons we did the TPP update in 2020 was really to get the transportation policy plan on schedule to align with the update of what we call the Regional Development Guide, or Thrive MSP 2040. So that update of that document, which is the overall umbrella document for our region, it's really starting up now, and it will be the new 2050 plan scheduled for adoption in sometime during 2024. But the intervening years will be a very large discussion of what has changed in the past decade. Obviously, COVID is going to have a lot of influence on how we need to change our Thrive MSP plan, and also how we need to change the TPP in reaction to both Thrive and other events like COVID. So that work, it's going to be a lot of work over the next 2 to 3 years. But then during 2024, we will adopt the updated Thrive MSP 2040. We'll adopt a new transportation policy plan for looking out to 2050. We'll also have a wastewater plan, a parks plan. All of that will come together during 2024 and align with one another based upon the work that we're going to be doing between now and 2024. So that's kind of a quick answer. I see Deb Barber wants to chime in too.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. Part of this plan does include studies relative to COVID, because the studies that we do now inform the next version. And we are doing studies right now internally related to the TBI, so the Travel Behavior Inventory. And we're going to continue to do that because we see it's not going to be completely stagnant situation. It's going to continue to change. And we want to make sure we're identifying just some of those trends that you were talking about, Mayor, that we want to make sure that we're considering as we're looking how we start investing and planning over the long term. So you're spot on, and but we're actively doing that both with this plan update and internally at council.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Mr. Chair?
Member Lindeke had a question in the chat room.
Thanks for calling on me, but Mayor Windschuttle kind of asked what I was going to ask. I was sort of interested in whether Mndot is also thinking about how peak commuting, a lot of highway planning is done around peak commuting travel demand. And so whether that's starting to change in any way, I'd be interested in just thinking about that for the future.
Good. Thank you, Member Lindeke. Member DeGan. You're on mute, Member DeGan.
Thank you. Reminder. Appreciate it. For Ms. Fenowitz, would you, the main themes, the first one, eliminating roadways, and you added some other comments that I wasn't able to pick up.
Yes, Mr. Chair and members. So when we went through the comments, we picked out 3 major themes. The first was reduce roadway expansion overall. The second was more strongly recognize equity and inequity within our investment processes and seek to use our investments to reduce inequities. And then the third general comment was related to parking policy, and that the TPP should have best practices and methods for cities to use to reduce parking within their communities, and that will have a positive change on climate change impacts.
Mr. Chair, may I follow up?
Yes, again, please.
Yes, I went through the overview in several chapters, and just so that I'm clear, in the overview, the redlining is obvious, but the yellow highlights are the additions. Okay, so they're the additions, and then in the overview, I'm sorry, in the individual chapters, it's simply redline and then bolded, I believe.
Chair, yeah, Chair, if I could just respond to Mr. Deanne's question. In the overview, some of the red lines indicate replacement of text. When you open the PDF, if you open the comment tab along the right-hand side, you should be able to see all of the replacement text. and tab through those in that way if you want to read them as each one goes by.
Okay, such as Maskey, quote, move this content to page 3, paragraph 2. Is what
Correct.
Okay.
So in that comment column, you'll be able to see everything that was recommended changed.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I noted first that you were it was redlined that we would be getting 803,000 new residents, but it's now to 472,000 new jobs. That was interesting. Thank you.
Right, you bet. Thank you.
Mr. Chair?
Yes, Member Hollinshead.
I just want to make a comment on flexibility. I believe the language in the Constitution is highway purposes. And during the bonding debate in the legislature, this was brought up. How do we define highway purposes? So I wonder if in the TPP, staff and leadership feels it's appropriate to explore at all what highway purposes mean in terms of the metro area, because we really pursue allocations according to how you define that. And so when we say TDM is the first priority, how much money can we give to TDM with a very narrow definition of highway purposes, and how much money can we give to TDM with a broad interpretation of highway purposes? In other words, is it not a highway purpose to shift commuters and using the COVID as an opportunity to lock in some telecommuting, a lot of telecommuting that did not otherwise occur before? So if Ms. Benowitz or anyone else who wants to could comment on whether we think it's appropriate for the Met Council to explore its own definition of highway purposes.
Benowitz.
Mr. Chair and members, so I think you're asking a great question, something that needs more definition around it, probably. We hope to get at that question in a little bit of a roundabout manner through the equity evaluation, because the equity evaluation will look at our funding processes, many of which come through the constitutional dedication, the statutory formulas. And so it will ask questions about whether or not those processes are equitable. And I think part of those questions will get at exactly what you're saying is, what is highway purpose? What does highway purpose mean? What does trunk highway purpose mean, which is a little bit different than highway purpose in general. And so I think we will get to those questions through that study without specifically going into detail only on that.
If I may, a follow-up.
Yes, Member
Chair. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate that, and I certainly support that. But I think the equity lens, as primary as its importance is not the full scope of the lens that I would propose for exploring the definition of highway purposes. So I just wonder, maybe in the 2050 plan, TPP, in advance, we could lay out how we would talk about highway purposes as applying to almost everything we do in transportation, not just equity. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yes, thank you for that thought.
Mr. Chair, I have a question or a comment.
Yes, bear with me a moment, Member Narayanan. Ms. Venowitz, any comment?
Mr. Chair, no, not specifically. As I said, I do agree that in general, what does highway purpose mean needs more definition, investigation, maybe a little expansion on how we've used it in the past. And I think that's something we can explore with Mndot in particular, since a lot of the funding directly flows through them. But I think that's a great suggestion.
All right, thank you. Member Narayanan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. my comment is almost exactly building on Member Holland's comments as well. I feel like the response in the TPP that flexible funds are cannot be used for various purposes is not necessarily accurate. I think we really need to do a little bit more of a deep dive on what exactly that means. I think different legislatures and different governors have had different interpretations of it, and I'd really maybe seek some more guidance from Met Council staff on what exactly flexible funding means, and maybe giving us in the tab some more opportunity to see where some of those funds could be flexed, just so we have a better understanding. Specifically, I'm thinking of, if, for example, funds could be used for transit within Mndot's right-of-way that could come from highway purpose funds, things like that. So anything that staff can do to help us get a better understanding of what flexible funds mean, I think would help us make better decisions at the tab. Thank you.
Thank you, Member Naryan.
Mr. Chair.
Member Reich.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I think this inquiry is going in a good direction. I like the notion of going deeper into different types of highways. I think trunk highways, as was mentioned, certainly is a different type of animal in terms of how it interfaces with communities, what potential upsides and downsides in terms of design can be garnered or avoided. I would also suggest that when we have these mentions of equity, it might not be appropriate in the current paragraphs where it's being highlighted and lifted up, which I of course appreciate, but there should be some element of our commitment to measure and demonstrate outcomes. There's a lot of talk about intention, a lot of talk about how we're going to look at it, how we're going to strategize around it, how we're going to implement, but there seems to need some kind of indication, if not in this particular language, somewhere where we are committed to upfront, and then we can hold ourselves accountable to our plans when we say that we will have measurements for outcomes so that make things apparent, not only to the technical, but also to the layperson. I think there's a disadvantage because it's sometimes an abstract and not apparent, the outcomes in our body, in the same way that, say, regional balances. Regional balance, we see a map, we see a 5-year set of investments, we can put little dots, we see where it happened or didn't happen. Equity is a little more ephemeral in how we view our outcomes. And so I think we need to take it to another level in terms of how we demonstrate outcomes in this category that we're now finally lifting up in a more appropriate way.
Right. Thanks for that comment. I'm going to go to Member Barber and then come back to that momentarily.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just in response to that, I know that we're trying to do exactly that through the transportation and Metro Transit, and trying to figure out how to get to good quality measurable outcomes as you're talking about. It's something that I think that as TAB is moving down the pathway of expanding their focus on equity as well, it'll be good to kind of circle both the work that's being done with the Transportation Committee at Council with what's happening with TAB. Because if we can start to align on what the right things to measure are relative to transportation and transit, that would be, I think, a great asset to the region. And yeah, very much welcome those discussions going forward. So,
Mr. Chair and Council Member Wright, too, if I might add, so similar to what Metro Transit is doing to develop and adopt equity measures, Mndot is currently going through that process too, and I'm participating on their technical advisory committee, and a little bit we're letting them lead on the highway measures, but they expect to have suggested measures for highway related equity sometime in the middle of next year. And so that definitely, it's a good point, and we should probably acknowledge that in the TPP, but sometime next year we should have a set of equity measures for both transit and highways.
Right. Well, all those are good comments, and I think as we begin this community conversation on equity next month, so these are really important things to keep in mind. I think it will be a difficult process to figure out how to quantify what we want to accomplish here, because as Member Wright points out, it is ephemeral, elusive in a way. Strong commitments and then trying to figure out how to make sure you can quantify that is an important but difficult task. Back to the highway purposes conversation started by Member Hollinshead. Strikes me that with us having to update the TPP at least every 5 years, that we don't have to wait for 2050 to start to have this conversation. Maybe we could add this to our work list. Once we get past this next regional solicitation, maybe that should be part of our workload next year, along with equity, to be looking at least what our thoughts are from a TAB standpoint on highway purposes. So keep that thought in mind too, and give that some consideration over the next couple months. Member Malushnik, Commissioner Malushnik.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had the button pushed, but I guess we're not, I don't know how you're working there in your office, but so anyway, we'll move on.
I saw your, I finally saw your hand waving back and forth like a windshield wiper. So
that actually is a windshield wiper, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks for your persistence.
Well, that's all right. So yeah, because the comment was quite a while ago, but we talked about no expansion and comment. Maybe Amy can talk about, you know, in the regional solicitation process, it's the only way that our highest priority, our mobility projects are done strategic on the A minors, which I believe we have a study for a while back, and you were on the tab that explained to everyone how important A minors are to our regional transportation grid. So maybe if Amy could talk about that a little bit.
Yes, Mr. Chair and members, I think what you're referring to is really highway expansion gets funded in two ways. We get some funding through Mndot mobility funds, but they're limited, and those typically are on the principal arterial system, and lately have been funding MinPass expansions on the PA system. But the regional solicitation is really the place in our roadway categories where we offer funding that the counties typically apply for on the Mndot system, and then those funds are used for expansion on Mndot system, both the PA or A minor system, though typically it is roadways that Mndot otherwise would not have funding available to do those projects.
I'm going to follow up, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Commissioner, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And in our county, our A minors are, in many cases, the primary way for our folks to get to transit. So thank you.
All right.
And Mr. Chair, if I could.
Yes, Mayor. Go ahead.
Just to touch on Commissioner Maluchnik, because I was concerned, I was trying to get in too, and if I heard it right from Ms. Venowitz, that we didn't want to support road expansions, but for us that that are growing at such a rapid rate, I would be a hard time to say that I wouldn't support expansion of roads. We still need that, like Commissioner Maluchnik talked about, to be able to get to the bus lines, and we only have the one, so we don't have that capability. And to say that we don't support road expansion, I would have a hard time voting in favor of that. And maybe I misunderstood it, but that's the way I thought I heard it. But like the Commissioner said, it was a while ago in the conversation. I've been trying to get in on that. So,
all right, thank you. Member Barber has a comment, and then.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I understand that concern. We do support expansion that's in the transportation policy plan. Part of what this part of it at the end is balancing the interplay of the overall planning and also reflecting the public comments that we're getting. And so some of the public comments were along those lines. And so it's just a recognition of that that's in the plan.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chair and members, and the one thing I might add to that response is that in the TPP, I guess I would not label it as support or not support expansion. What we try to point out is that there's kind of a continuum of how you find the appropriate solution for a roadway problem. And the first place we're encouraging people to go is to determine if they can address congestion through travel demand management. Can we invest in transit? Can we invest in bike ped? Can we reduce demand overall through telecommuting? And then if we've already explored those strategies, then we move on to other strategies that might involve highway expansion. So it's not that we want to eliminate highway expansion. We just want to make sure we kind of move through that continuum of what other types of solutions might we look to first and before we jump to a highway expansion solution.
Follow up on that, Mr. Chair?
Go ahead, Mayor.
Is that something then that the city or counties have to do that, or is that something that we as the tab would do to do those different studies to figure out a way to try to reduce that before we went into a full road expansion?
Mr. Chair and members, so the TPP really applies to the PA and A minor system. This is a policy level document, so we certainly don't have any means to really require someone to go through that continuum, but I think what we're suggesting is that that's a good way to think about roadway investment, and that it certainly is a cheaper way, so that we should first explore those types of solutions before we jump to a more expensive, larger roadway solution. But we don't prohibit any of the expansion solutions in and of themselves.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions for Ms. Venowitz? Comments from folks? Really some very thoughtful comments here. Well, we've got a recommended motion here, and that is that the Transportation Advisory Board recommend to the Metropolitan Council that they adopt the 2020 update of the 2040 Transportation Policy Plan. Is there a motion to that effect?
So moved, Mr. Chair.
Second, Mr. Chairman.
All right, motion by Member Barber, second by Member Malushnik. Any further discussion? Roll call, please.
Anderson,
Aye.
Bailey,
Aye.
Barber,
Aye.
Barnes,
Aye.
Boyles,
Aye.
Crimmins,
Aye.
Dugan,
Aye.
Foster,
Aye.
Fox,
Aye.
Geisler,
Aye.
Giuliani Stevens, Patel,
Aye.
Heyman Roland,
Aye.
Hanson,
Aye.
Holberg,
No.
Collins Head,
I'm going to take a pass or abstain.
Karwoski, aye.
Lindeke,
Aye.
Look,
No.
Maluchnik,
Aye.
Ewan,
Aye.
McGuire,
Aye.
Narayanan,
Aye.
Dietrich,
Aye.
Reich, Sanger,
Aye.
Schember,
Aye.
Tolbert,
Yes.
Ulrich,
Aye.
Windshuttle,
Aye.
Washi,
Aye.
and for the record, the last vote that we took, Bert voted aye as well.
All right, the motion is approved. 2020-36, the TPP update has been approved for submission to the Met Council. Now we're going to move into that information section that we talked about, and I think this, I don't know if we'll get to arterial BRT or even a quick community conversation on where we're going to go next on equity, because I expect the funding scenarios for the regional solicitation to take a significant portion of the balance of our time. So as I mentioned earlier in my comments, you know, we started with 5 funding themes or scenarios. Each of those columns is a separate option trying to get down to a more manageable number here than the 5 that we had originally started with. And now we have 6 due to the TAC requesting a regional highway funding scenario. And that funding scenario, if included in our conversation, would shift, as I mentioned earlier, shift $5 million back into that category. That was a shift we determined to make at the last solicitation, which moved $5 million from highways, roadways back into a combination of transit and bike ped. And the consequences of that shift, I think, has some implications for some projects both ways. So there'd be more spot mobility and safety, and then one less transit project if we moved into that scenario. So the light orange scenario is the TAC requested regional highway scenario. And then we're going to have some conversation. I think I might early on, as Steve Peterson's going through this, have Mike Barnes explain after we get past table 2 or to table 2 some of the concerns that Mndot has. But having said that, from a backgrounding standpoint, and again, reminding folks we're working with about 200 million here, and then that 20 million in over programming, I think we can safely deal with and include in our conversation and our computations. And how that gets used is another question. I think it's separate and distinct from one of the funding scenarios that we might eventually end up with, and that is, it could be looked at as just being allocated amongst the different functional classifications, or we could also look at it in terms of trying to achieve some geographic balance, if you will. So, Steve Peterson, I'll turn to you now and let you lead the conversation here as we go about looking at these different scenarios.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. You're doing a great job. You might want to just continue explaining all this, but we did want to, especially for the people who are going through this process, this 2-year process for the first time, we did get 1 or more requests to do a deep dive on more of the tables and the rules and the process. And if people would like that in the next few weeks before the next TAB meeting, please email Elaine, and I would be happy to offer a 60 or 90-minute session just on the process and rules, and so you can be caught up to speed on that. So again, email Elaine or Chair Helpland on that one. So looks like Greg has the PowerPoint up. Next slide, please. So no votes to be taken today. Again, we've got 3 months to hopefully get to a decision. Today is the first time you'll see the funding scenarios that we talked about last month in the abstract. Then next month, there'll be another info item, and then December will be the action item. Next slide, please. So the purpose of today's meeting, again, provide the first draft of the what was 5, now 6 funding scenarios. We did have a good conversation both with a joint TAC funding and programming meeting earlier this month. So we'll forward the technical comments from those, and Chair Freeze can help me from the TAC level on that one. Get some further direction on the over-programming approach. We'll show you what we've done to date, and as Chair Helpland noted, we've put about $20 million more into the pot and allocated it with a similar approach to the other monies. But certainly you could try and meet some other policy objective with that and do something else with the 20 million. Wanted some further direction on some of the transit rules. Remember, some of the big changes that were instituted revolved around transit. One was the ABRT set aside, which we approved last month here to shift to the April decision. And there are also a few other ones, and we'll walk through those here today, but that was brought up at the TAC level as far as what the outcomes produced from some of the new rules that we instituted. Number 5 is to consider the new regional highway scenario. Again, that was an additional $5 million from transit back to roadways. That was requested by the TAC funding and programming joint meeting for your consideration. And then hopefully, again, we've got the 6 different funding options today. To get to one consensus here by December, we're hoping to eliminate 1 or 2 or 3 of them today that you don't like as a group here. So next slide, please.
So before you move on here,
Yeah.
Peter, I think, or Steve, I think Peter Dugan had a quick point he wanted to make.
Yes.
Member Dugan?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, I have to acknowledge the great work that Chair Freeze and Mr. Peterson and Mr. Barbeau have put in on this. There was a joint TAC and TAC funding and programming meeting last Wednesday. It lasted well over 2 hours on regional solicitation. And then tomorrow there's a follow-up one for those who want to learn more. They're very informative. At the start of this, I would like to make just a couple of comments. I think as we go through this, I have concerns about mission creep. We do have a mission, but it seems it's mission creep. And also I would ask for the historical distribution by counties of the projects, particularly for Dakota, and certainly want to defer and chat with Commissioner Holberg, Mayor Mary, and Councilmember Hanson. Even though Mr. Hanson comes from the cities of the second class, he still is an Eagan City Council member. I would ask that we try to get to no more than 3 scenarios. 2, I think, is better. We just have to make the hard choices. However, flexibility and fairness to all is important. And the other aspect that I asked Steve and Amy to do is to compile a list of the unwritten rules that we have, such as the EBRT set aside, such as the bridges of 10 million. We have all these small rules, about principal arterials, A minors, that I'm not sure some of the newer members and myself, I'm not sure I remember all of them. And that's where I think of the mission creep. But we need to stick with in my opinion, we need to stick with the mission of the tab. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for your time. And members, thank you for your time.
Thank you. Member Dugan. All right, go ahead, Steve.
Sure. Thanks for your comments to Member Dugan. So what we've done today is come up with 6 different themes, and the question, the task that was asked of us as staff is we have roughly $200 million. How do we divide that $200 million based on the 12 application categories that you see on the screen? So there's lots of ways potentially you could do it, and we'll talk about how we've drafted that up and get some concurrence on a few approaches. Next slide. Here's a few of the rules that Member Dugan had mentioned, and we'll try and hit on as many as we can during today's presentation. What TAB approved as part of the application was to set aside 2.5% of the total dollars, which amounts to about $4.9 million for unique projects. Just like the City of St. Paul Our Car unique project that you approved last time, those types of projects, which we still have, the goal of next year is to define what those projects are. But a lot of those projects don't want money 5 years from now. They want money closer to when they're going to implement the project. So what you had approved was setting aside that $4.9 million. 2 years from now, we do a call for projects, for unique projects, and allocate that $4.9 million. So that comes off the top. So that's how we go from 198 million down to 193. So that's one thing to mention. Some of the other new rules revolved around transit. So TAB did approve midpoints for the 3 different modes. So those were, and this is on the next couple slides too, we'll get to it, but the midpoint for transit of a funding range that TAB put forth accounted for about 30% of the total funds, which equals $58 million. So last month, you asked staff, or directed staff, I should say, to set aside $25 million of that $58 million for an arterial BRT project to be discussed and approved by this committee in April. So that's $25 million. In the past, we've generally set aside another $7 million, and that is the base level funding for all the TMOs in the region. And in the amount of $5.8 million, and then the remainder, $1.2 million of that is this innovative TDM projects, which you'll see in the tables. So that's obviously up to you whether you want to continue that $7 million set aside for both the TMOs and the TDM funding. So if you do so, that would leave $26 million for transit and to be allocated among both transit expansion and transit modernization projects. Next slide, please. So back to the midpoints, as shown in the table here, third row down. So the midpoint refers to a funding range that we've had since 2014, essentially, to give applicants an indication of how much money is going to be spent in the different modes. So the midpoint, as it was shifted, and we talked about the shifting of $5 million in that midpoint towards transit. So the midpoint where it landed was 55.5% for roadways. That amounts to $107 million. So that's what we're trying to hit from all the roadway projects. After the set asides we talked about, it'd be $26 million left for transit, and then $28 million for the 3 bicycle pedestrian project application categories. Okay, next slide, please. So we've come up with, or we're bringing to you 6 different themes or options on how to allocate that money among the 12 application categories. We'll go through those one by one, and we've color-coded them, and it makes it a little bit easier. So number one, we used to be called the base, now we're calling it historical process. It isn't looking at the what we've spent by area over the past X number of years. This is just for the 2020 cycle, and we named it historical process, but you could name it base or the traditional process, what we've used the last 3 times. So we go to the midpoint of those funding ranges that we just discussed on the last slide, and then we allocate the money between the roadway applications based on the number of applications submitted and the amount of money requested. Now the new, what TAC is asking for your consideration to do is to add a regional highway. So a new funding scenario, number 2, we've indicated in light orange because it's very similar to the historical process. But what we've done is shifted, $5 million from transit back to roadways. And that essentially gets you 2 more intersection improvement projects, spot mobility and safety, and you lose 1 transit expansion project. And we'll show you the details as we get into the tables. Number 3 is the bigger project. So again, it follows that midpoint of the modal funding ranges, but instead we focus on the larger project categories. And so what that would be in roadways would be the strategic capacity or new interchanges. In the bicycle pedestrian, it would be the multi-use trail, which remember we had a long discussion on the maximum award there. We kept it at 5.5 million. So we have some bigger projects there and a lot of trail bridges. So if you want to go to that policy directive of bigger projects, you might want to consider the green. Number 4 keeps that same amount of funding per mode, but flips it and funds more smaller project application categories. So it's not shifting money between the modes, it's keeping that constant, but it is funding more like, safe routes to school projects, pedestrian projects that are smaller dollar value projects. In roadways, it's more of the ITS, which are called traffic management technologies, or spot mobility intersection projects. So you're going to get more projects this way spread across the region, but they're going to be smaller, and that's the trade-off. Next slide, please. The last 2 themes that we put together were based on the TPP comments. The first one is the only change is on the roadway side. So it keeps the money the same, that midpoint, but instead of funding as many strategic capacity or interchange type projects, it shifts it to other roadway types. So that would be purple. And then lastly is another shift. So this is a shift, so it's not the midpoints any longer. Number 6 is shifting $10 million from roadways to bike ped and funding more of those types of projects. So those 2, again, respond to the TPP comments that Amy Venowitz just discussed. Next slide, please. And so what are the outcomes that you get from these 6 scenarios? It's a little overwhelming at this point when we've got 6 of them. So the first three scenarios that we talked about, shown as historical process, regional highways, and bigger projects, you're going to get larger projects, but fewer projects. And that's the trade-off. And here we're showing the total transportation investment and the leveraging of those projects is greater. During our TAB executive meeting, Member Barnes from Mndot did acknowledge that much of that match is coming from Mndot, and the more projects that you get further down that list, because many of the county projects are on Mndot system and require some sort of level of match from Mndot. The more projects you do, the more risk there is that Mndot's not able to match those projects. So that's one thing that he noted from this earlier this morning. The last three themes, more projects, less road expansion, and bike ped, fund more projects, but most of those are at the 80-20, so 80% federal, 20% local match. So smaller project types, but more projects and more unique project applicants, the second to last column there. The last thing to note is the funded equity projects. So we've, through the scoring process, essentially came up with what are the 10 projects that scored the best on our equity measure, and how many of those would we fund in each of the different themes. And that varies from 7 to 9, depending on the category. But in most cases, we are funding a lot of those projects that we said, or that did score through our process very high on the equity side. Next slide, please. So I think we're going to move to the memo, Greg, if we could. Shift over there and get into the some of the details of the scenarios and some of the TAC feedback that we heard. So if you could scroll down, Greg, to the tables. And Mr. Chair, I don't know if you want to pause there as we're getting there to see if there's any questions on what the themes were that we put together.
We could do that, although I think this continuity of going to the actual tables is important. So I'd be inclined to just keep you moving unless somebody has a question. They can just speak up. I think because we've got the screen occupied by the PowerPoint. So if you feel like you want to make ask a question in process here, members, just go ahead and speak up, and I'll recognize you, and you can ask your question.
So in the
only proviso I would say, Steve, as we get to table 2, maybe we should back up to table 2 again, which is a reflection of what you had just talked about. I wonder if this wouldn't be an appropriate time for Mike Barnes to make comments about Mndot and some of the concerns that they have. Member Barnes?
Yes, Mr. Chair. Steve had kind of alluded to it here. I brought it up in the earlier meeting that, as we're looking at this, the first three, the one that's the historical process, regional, and the bigger projects, and there's another chart that we'll see that shows the number of projects in what would be the strategic capacity area category. It starts to pick up more of them. And what I had mentioned to the group earlier is based on kind of where we're sitting now with the projected funding out there in 24-25 because of decrease in traffic with the COVID. We're kind of anticipating still somewhere in a 10 to 15% decrease. Again, that can change based on forecasts, but because of that, because of the recent bond package that came out that had it had 5 projects that were kind of the capacity type projects that didn't rank high out of this regional solicitation or weren't even submitted to it. So those are additional projects. And then grants, we had the grants that came into the state. Example is the Highway 10 with Ramsey Sunfish that at 40 million, which still has some gaps, and so there will probably be an expectation or anticipation of something from the state. And again, with that, it's a trunk highway. So there's unknowns from just between the grant side, the projections, the bond funds. Then we also had the corridors of commerce. So what I was letting the group know is that with any kind of capacity that is there for any dollar that's available to be a match, there's probably already 2 or 3 projects that are really going to be looking for it. So the more projects that are listed in this strategic capacity area, the higher the risk or the higher the chance that there would not be the funding available, again, unless some form of funding package of additional funds were to change, or it was even brought up about federal funds if some federal package was to come in, but again, state funds are needed for match unless, again, the program change. But at this point, the risk, the likelihood is the risk is high, the likelihood is very low that we'd be able to match on the list that's any of the ones that were, or excuse me, the full list of the historical process, regional highway, or the bigger projects. So sometimes out of this, the less is better when it comes to being able to help make sure they're funded. And there'll be other discussions, I'm sure, from the group about, not needing Mndot funding, and I just want people to be aware and be upfront as we're going through that, that this is going to be the higher potential or risk of not having matching funds. So I'll kind of leave it with that.
All right, thank you, Member Barnes. And then also, Steve, I think you should comment on the 6 scenarios. Do we have functional classification covered in every scenario?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We do, and that was another one of the Peter Dugan's rules that he wanted us to note. So we do have 5 eligible functional classifications, and one of the rules is that we fund at least one project in each of those, and all of the scenarios do meet that standard of one project, at least one project per roadway type.
Okay. All right, let's go back to you and back to the tables.
Yeah, so Greg, if you could scroll down, please, to that table 4. And maybe we can, during the comments, we can get back to this, but just to let you know that we have looked at geographic balance. That is how the projects are spread throughout the different counties. We typically have looked at both population and jobs, and one of the reasons for population is that the money comes to the region largely based on population. So that's a good proxy to use, but we'll probably come back to this. But there's 2 tables on geographic balance on the number of projects submitted by county and how much funding dollar-wise and percentage-wise they're getting. Moving down, please. The next set of tables here, we could. Yep, right there. So we'll go through each of the modes, just point out a couple of the key highlights that we want you to be aware of. And again, we can offer to meet one-on-one with people or later to go through some more details. But in the roadways area, we do have 5 different application categories. So each of those is scored independently. So you can't compare across categories because the measures are different based on what we're aiming to get. So again, on this page, there's three categories: traffic management technologies, spot mobility and safety, which is the new intersection safety and mobility category, and strategic capacity. The strategic capacity was the one that Member Barnes was mentioning, because most of those are county or city led on Mndot system. And so the further you go down that list, the more interaction with Mndot because they're the primary roadway owner there. So on the top of the page is the traffic management technologies. Again, the projects all scored pretty close to one another and pretty well. So, a good mix of projects there, and we're funding between 2 and 5 of those, depending on the scenario. In spot mobility and safety, again, this is the brand new category for intersections, trying to do some lower cost, high benefit type safety and mobility improvements. And funding anywhere from 2 to 8 of those, depending on where you go. But I did want to note on the far left side where you can see a gray, one of the cells is gray for the ID column on the second to far left there. Those are the equity bonus projects. So but one of them that jumps out, the first one is a City of Minneapolis one. And further down on this page, there's a Carver County one. So those were the 10, those will note the 10 equity bonus projects. We've also, at tax request, we are showing one over programming approach that could be taken. We have $200 million available. 10% over programming is 20 million. And so we assume that we've just increased our pool of money. And what would we do based on just having more money and using the approaches that we already have? As Chair Hovland said, you could take that $20 million and try and meet some other policy objective, whether it's geographic balance or equity bonus projects or something else, putting it where you wouldn't have to strictly follow kind of what we've laid out here. That's up to you, but we've shown you what we would have done, the decisions we would have made using the funding allocation methodology that we've prescribed here. So you'll see those in gray, and in each case, if you add them up, each column is about $20 million. So projects that are shown as being colored in, and these projects are ranked from highest to lowest. That's maybe the base thing here is those projects are funded. The gray projects that we're showing that say over program on there would be funded, but just in that scenario. And so if you add up the columns across all of these pages with the over programming plus what's colored, you're going to end up with about $220 million in each of these 6 different columns that are colored. So moving down on this page a little bit, Greg, if we could, please. So in the strategic capacity, one thing that we did want to note, besides the equity bonus project here from Carver County, is that number 3 on the list, and Member Barnes alluded to this, was a project that received the state's only infra project. So that was a federal competitive award for even a bigger project than what was applied for here. So that was the infra award that Anoka County received up in the city of Ramsey for 2 railroad grade separations and 2 interchanges. And you can see increasing the maximum award here to $10 million, where the money goes a little quicker than it was at $7 million. And depending on the scenario, we're funding between 2 and 7 projects. We really tried to, in the green scenario, we ended up putting about $70 million into this category, and that was an attempt to get 1 project for Scott County, and I'm sure that will come up later. We didn't, in all these scenarios, we didn't have a project for within Scott County out of the 5 that they had submitted within the county. This was an attempt to at least have 1 scenario that that got Scott County a project. Further down, please. If we could scroll to the next page. So the 2 other roadway categories, one was roadway reconstruction and modernization. And we're showing quite a bit of the over programming actually going to this area. The first 4 projects, interestingly enough, are all road diet projects, so lane reduction projects, primarily in our core cities. But that's one kind of interesting tidbit to take away from it. And all of these roadway projects, and we heard this at the TAC level, really are doing a nice job on multimodal elements in the projects, whether it's pedestrian underpasses or trails or sidewalks. The level of multimodal elements is literally millions of dollars on across the board here. So then lastly is the bridge projects. You may remember a rather long conversation at TAB, and we ended up landing on a $10 million target. So we've had floors, ceilings, and everything else in between for bridges, but we end up with a $10 million target. The first 2 projects have a tied score. So out of 1,100 points, we had a tied score for the top 2 bridge projects. One in Hennepin County, Rockford Road, and another one in St. Paul, the Kellogg Bridge, which also did receive the $52 million of bonding. So this would be a nice supplement to fill their funding gap remaining funding gap on that project. But if we follow that $10 million target, we'll end up with about $14 million in bridges by funding the first 2 projects. Next slide, please, or next PDF page. Here in transit, you'll see 4 tables. You've got the 2 competitive categories for transit expansion and modernization. Again, we're trying to hit about 26 million in total between those top 2 tables. And we'll talk about some of the rules here that in our interpretation of them. So you'll see 2 columns with red check marks in them. And in the application, what this body approved was no more than $7 million of BRT projects in these 2 categories would be funded in an attempt to spread the money across the region to different project types and our core bus service. An expansion of other bus service that was either non-ABRT or just BRT. We had 4 projects that submitted that staff thought fulfilled that BRT. We would check the box that they were a BRT project. We heard from several of those applicants saying, well, we are a BRT project, but we're also helping out the local bus service, or we're helping out pedestrians with, in one case, the pedestrian overpass. So, you know, should we have that check mark for BRT because we're BRT, but then we're also doing lots of things for other types of transit. So that's one comment that we heard. The other rule that was put in place was this new market guarantee. So that was, we wanted at least 1 project, a minimum of 1 project outside of essentially transit market areas 1 or 2, which is the Beltway, close to the Beltway. You can see several projects were submitted that at least touched outside of that area and fulfilled the new market guarantee. And we will be funding probably several of them and far exceed that minimum of one project type. So when staff was putting this together, the first dilemma that we encountered was remembering back to that $7 million maximum for BRT projects. The top scoring project in transit expansion, this top table, was submitted by Washington County, and it was a project that we said was connected to the Gold Line BRT project. So $7 million. So that would take up the entire $7 million. Then our partners scored the transit modernization, and the top project there, again, $7 million, and that was a project submitted by Metro Transit for downtown St. Paul stations for Gold Line and other transit service that uses those downtown stations. So we asked those project partners and said, you know, if we strictly follow this rule and only 1 project can be funded, which one would you like to be funded? Because you're both the top scoring projects and you're both $7 million. So from staff's perspective, we can only fund 1 of those. So the project partners, in this case, Washington County, Metro Transit, Ramsey County, perhaps some of the cities are involved with the conversation too, said that their preference, if only 1 could be funded, would be the top project in transit modernization, the downtown St. Paul station, $7 million. So we're showing that as highlighted, but we're skipping the Washington County project, the top one on the top table. Now, there's 2 other BRT projects that were submitted and did score quite well on the second table, transit modernization. And those were both on the red line, but did obviously have other, as we heard, other benefits beyond just the BRT station or BRT red line. One of those was the number 3 ranked project on that, which was a pedestrian overpass of Cedar Avenue. In every scenario, we are showing that project being skipped. They asked for $2.4 million, but because we've already hit that $7 million max, we're skipping over that one. The fifth highest ranked project also was submitted, in this case by Apple Valley, also for involved the red line station. And in several of the scenarios, I guess 5 of the 6 were skipping that project as well because we met that threshold. There's another rule that also, you know, so if you loosened up that rule and TAC said, well, maybe consider loosening that rule, you would fund that top red line project, number 3 on that list. But because there's another rule that says you can only have 1 project per transitway per funding cycle. And that was put in, you know, many cycles ago when Central Corridor and Southwest came in, because those huge transitways could have essentially taken all the transit money for the region during that cycle. So I think TAB wanted to spread the money out throughout the region. So So in that case, there is that rule that you can only fund one project on Gold Line and one on Red Line, if we adhere to that rule as well. So I guess there's, we put in place some rules here, and the outcomes were something that the TAC members and funding and programming members at least wanted to bring up to this group as an issue area, and whether you do anything about that or let it play out is up to you as a tab, but they did make mention of that.
Mr.
I'm sorry.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
quick question, please, for Steve.
Yes. Member Sanger? Is it Member Sanger?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead.
The check marks for the new market area transit projects include projects in Minneapolis, Bloomington, St. Paul, which I do not believe those are new markets for transit. And I am actually questioning what is the definition of a new market project, and frankly, whether that classification it really has any value for us if it's going to include projects in areas that already have transit.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair and Member Sanger. So the definition for new market, it's not a brand new transit market, maybe as the name suggests. It's that at least one end of the project has to touch outside of transit market areas 1 or 2. And so in some cases, you have routes that extend further into the suburbs, but maybe they still do touch one of the core cities or first string suburbs. But that would still be under the definition that was approved by TAB, would still be considered as constituting a new market project.
Okay, thank you.
But I agree with you. It is confusing from the name to say that some of these projects are new market. So scrolling down slightly here, Greg, on the page, if we could please. So we've up to, yep, right there, perfect. At the last tab meeting, you did approve. There we go. Looks like Cole has sent a link to the transit market areas, so you can take a look at what those are. Thanks, Cole. TAB did approve the $25 million for one ABRT project, and that's shown on the slide and taken out of the total. Again, we talked about the $7 million for the TMO set aside in TDMs, which is shown on the next table down. And then finally, if you could scroll up just a little bit, Greg. Making you work here. The last table on this page is the TDM money that you had set aside 2 years ago. So again, those projects don't want money 5 years out. They want projects now. They want the money now so they can implement new technologies and new ways of thinking. So we had $1.2 million that we set aside 2 years ago that we're now allocating, and we're essentially able to fund all of those projects and maybe partial funding to that last project. We only had 4 submittals for those innovative TDM projects, and we'll be able to fund all of those if TAB approves that. So next page, please, Greg. Again, you can see on now we're moving into the transit or into the bicycle and pedestrian category. So there's 3 distinct application categories here with different scoring. Again, scored by 50 or so of our project partners throughout the region over the course of this past summer. Several of these projects did receive that equity bonus. And you'll see that with the gray highlighting again in the ID column on the far left side. The multi-use trails is the top category, always the most popular submission. We had 37 that made it through the qualifications here. And again, the top projects, good projects, but they are higher dollar value projects. And so all of those are $4 million plus. So that does take away a decent share of the $28 million for bicycle pedestrian is some of those bigger projects. Not that that's good, bad, or indifferent, but just making note of that and the discussion that you had about whether to lower it, raise it. We ended up keeping it at that $5.5 million. But we probably are only going to be able to fund roughly about 10 projects out of the 37 with the dollars available for bicycle pedestrian. And several ties are very, you can see on the far right side, the scores in descending order, they're really, really close. In many cases, there's ties or 1 point differentiates projects. And it's tough to break a tie in many of those cases to say one project is more valuable than the other. It's really, it's really not for 1 point out of 1,100.
Mr. Chair, if I can make a comment, as long as it's charged up. If you noticed, in the 3 categories to the left, even though they're large projects and such, there's a lot of trails in those large projects, traditional projects now, kind of a new way of thinking for counties and cities. So even though you've added categories like bike and ped and more projects, it really isn't resulting in any noticeable difference in the amount of bike pedway trails. I just wanted to note that as long as this chart was up.
All right, thank you. Sure.
Okay, thank you. Moving down the page here, Greg, please. So two more categories. The first of which is pedestrian facilities. Again, a $1 million maximum award there, and we will be able to fund with the dollars available anywhere from 4 to 8 of those projects. Again, because they're lower costs, you can fund quite a few of them with not making too much of a dent. The same is true with Safe Routes to School. The last on the top of the next page here, where you can fund quite a few with most of them are all in the $500,000 to $1 million range. Projects number 3 and 4 on that list. I guess one is from the city of Chaska and one is the city of Minneapolis. Did receive the equity bonus, so those are 2 projects that were on the line that we attempted to fund through many of the scenarios because they did achieve that equity bonus. And it's good to fund those projects where we can. So that wraps up the tables, Mr. Chair. We also, further back in this presentation, there's maps that show you the trade-offs between the funding scenarios. So what projects you gain or lose from a geographic standpoint throughout the region. And so some people like the table, some people like the map. So we put in both for the members here to get a sense for the trade-offs that you'll be exploring over the next 2 months between the scenarios. But again, I think just to circle back here to the main goals of today, if we can eliminate several of these funding scenarios today, I think that would be a good goal. We'll bring that starting even tomorrow to our tax funding and programming committee, and they'll point out some more technical either challenges or pros and cons of these scenarios and other avenues. But I think the real goal is to have a discussion on these general themes, and if there's some of them that we can start removing from the process. So back to you, Mr. Chair.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Steve, for that comprehensive presentation. It sends your mind twirling with all the possibilities. And for the county commissioners, I trust they're getting some guidance from their staff on some of these potential funding scenarios, which is helpful. But for citizen reps and other local electeds and agency heads, everybody's grappling with it on their own, I think. So we can start a conversation. And I think Member Geisler had his hand up. Start with Member Geisler.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. As many will know, I spent a lot of time crunching numbers because that's what I like to do, to look at some of the scenarios. And one of the first things I looked at was, the long-term regional balance between the areas, not only from just this current solicitation, but the last 3 that I've had the pleasure to see, but also back to 2003 since we started the process, if I'm correct there. And kind of crunched it across the various scenarios here, and really there's one item that I'd like to maybe push forward that I think can address multiple concerns and multiple items that we've been kind of talking around here, and I think would also simplify some of our funding scenarios. Specifically, what I think would be beneficial for this organization to do would be to shift all of our over-programming into the bike ped area. And let me kind of lay out why. Regardless of which scenario we pick, what it does in that way is it relieves a little bit of the work from the Mndot concerns of a lot of those are going to be not necessarily roads. And so we resolve some of that funding perspective. We would end up with more projects. Depending exactly on how staff wants to do it, we could end up with a net increase of 10 more projects funded across the whole region. And from a regional balance perspective, when you look back to 2003 to 2020, it actually improves the regional balance on 4 counties and is effectively a net zero change or pretty dang rounding error change for 2 of them. Only 1 county would have a slightly downward shift, and all of those shifts would be less than 1% from their population ratios. So they would be relatively, it would be moving towards where we would want to go. Ultimately, it would be kind of, if we were to do that, we'd be looking at 2 fewer roadways, 1 less transit expansion, and 13 PED projects funding all those safe routes to schools and those pedestrian facilities, as Steve had mentioned, that are relatively low cost compared to the rest of them. With that said, I think if we were to do that kind of over programming, that would allow us to strike the bike ped plus $10 million because effectively it puts 20 million into bike ped, and we can pick any of the rest of the scenarios as we see fit, because we'd be moving that over programming funding there. That's just kind of my 2 cents on, I think, where we could do to facilitate the multiple angles that we're trying to get to, the multiple issues that we try to address. By no means do I think it is perfect. I don't think there's necessarily a perfect solution to be had in this at any point in time. But I do think that it would result in more projects being done across the region in every county, with the exception of Scott not having any at that level. And spreading the wealth is, I think, part of the goal of this scenario. And as we've seen with COVID, and we've heard concerns about, well, really, should we be going deeper on transit? Should we be going wider on roads? The one thing we haven't really questioned is we know people are using bike ped and facilities more when they're in their local region. So I do believe that would facilitate a lot. Happy to get into the deeper numbers, but I won't bore everyone with that, but just kind of a strategic conversation there.
What does what do your calculations do with respect to Scott County?
Scott County ends up with a 0 to 0. The only, as Steve had mentioned, the only place where Scott County really gets funded is the bigger projects scenario. We could still leave that funding scenario on the table and then still put all the over programming in bike ped. I did my numbers based off of the historical process one, since that's the one we've chosen the most often. But I think if that was the guidance, was to say if we shifted all the over programming there and used one of the other funding scenarios, I think that could help.
Did you look at the over programming of bike ped at 10 million and then reserve the other 10 and look at the effects of that? Or in fact, wouldn't that give us the Scott County project if we went that route? Because that was a $10 million issue, I think, down in Jordan, if I recall correctly. Commissioner Ulrich, you could help me on that one.
If I may respond, the question that I would just say was that the Scott County getting funded is using the bigger projects under the strategic capacity. It isn't being funded under over programming. What would happen would be the net result is project 5 and 6 in the roadway category and project 5 in the transit expansion that are currently flagged as over programming would go away. And then again, theoretically, projects 11 through 16 on bike ped could be funded, projects 4 through 8 on the pedestrian facilities, and projects 5 and 6 in SRTS would be funded. The net of that is basically a minus 19.6 and a plus 13.3. So the math actually balances out.
Yeah, what I was really asking you was if we have flexibility on use of over programming dollars, certainly with the blue scenario suggesting an over programming of bike ped at 10 million, that's potentially half the over programming money. If we go that route, then the other over programmed amount, the other 10 million that we could potentially over program, could go to Scott County so that we achieve geographic balance. Is that correct?
Yep, that could work.
Yeah, Mayor Hovland, this is
Yeah.
John Ulrich. Yeah, the project in Jordan, 169-252-9 is a $10 million project. I was going to comment on geographic balance. Just generally, we've tried for that in every solicitation, within the solicitation, to have geographic balance. And to achieve that, sometimes in the past, we've even leapfrogged down to pick up a project in a county that wasn't getting a project. And I was going to suggest, outside of the scenarios, deal with the programming money separately, and have the first look at that overprogramming money and say, okay, is there a region, is there a county not receiving a project? Let's look at that and use the first money of overprogramming for a county that's not getting a project. And if that project fits within all the funding allocations, even better. But I was thinking that you could pick whatever scenarios you deem appropriate, hold out that 20 million over programming, and then decide how you want to use that after the scenarios are selected. Right now, they've tacked that into the funding formulas in all the scenarios, the over programming. I would say don't do that, but have it sit aside and then decide after. Now, even if you were to say you wanted the 20 million over programming to fit the funding formulas, I think 11 million would go to roadways under that scenario. So
that's an interesting point too. And typically we've put that geographic balance lens on at the last, when we get to the end of the scenario analysis. But it certainly could be that we would look at this in advance. That Member Geisler has got us thinking about it in a different way. Because if we looked at the overprogramming amount, we have to answer the question, do we feel comfortable doing that? Can we safely do the overprogramming? And B, can we use it to help achieve geographic balance right off the get-go? And then that might allow us, unlike what we've traditionally done, to pivot back to the funding scenarios and think about the point that Member Geisler is making. In this world where we're seeing so many people outside now using parks and trails, might we want to overprogram the blue column, the bike and ped, at 10 million, go to Scott County for 10, and then turn to the basic other 6 scenarios and see where we want to land there. I mean, that's just another idea on how to approach this. So others are going to have other ideas here. So I'm pleased to hear about some of them. Commissioner Karwoski first, and then Commissioner Malushnik.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, I do think we need to make sure all counties get some money here. I do like Commissioner Ulrich's point of view of taking the over-programming, targeting money specifically for the Scott County project. The TAB board did this for us a couple years ago in Washington County, where we were going to get 0. We had a project that was worthy and pretty close, so we made it score, and I appreciate that. And I think we all should, we all have a stake in this. So I like the over programming to fund Scott County. So I would like, and I think if we look closely, there's a lot of trails in both historical, regional, and big projects, the 3 on the left. But I wouldn't be resistant to funding some more trails, but I'd like to look at that closer, because I think roads are so expensive in this tight time of finances. But I do think I probably favor I think TAC recommended the regional highway. I strongly would stick with that, but particularly the 3 on the left. The 3 on the right, the more projects I think should get dropped, because it adds significant dollars to counties that are already doing pretty darn good. I think we should drop the bike and pedway, because it was mentioned there's a way to kind of fund some more through over programming. But I'd be careful there. And then I would still drop the less roadways. So the 3 on the left. If getting down to 3 helps, I'd argue for the 3 on the left side of the columns. Thank you.
Yeah, we don't have any columns up in front of us here. So what I hear you saying is that you prefer the historical process, regional roadway, and bigger projects being the three that we advance.
Yes, and then address Scott County with over programming dollars. Perhaps I'm a little bit receptive to some additional bike and pedway, but I'd like to learn more about that, and then drop the more projects, drop the less roadways, and drop the bike and pedway.
Well, then what are your thoughts relative to the concerns expressed by Mndot that you don't even know if they can do the match with the larger project?
Yeah, well, I would caution us to shift our strategy of TAB and go start picking out projects where we're not asking Mndot to be a partner. I think we need to have them as a partner, and Mndot's got to figure out a way through the legislature to meet our needs. I think when they warn us to don't pick projects where they're a partner because we can't count on their money, and then we start backing off on those requests, I think that's dangerous territory. Thank you.
All right, thank you for those comments. Commissioner Malushnik.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with the good commissioner from Washington County on the three categories that we should maintain. I'm very much in support of making sure that Scott County gets a project. We have in the past, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, we have gone with partials in our over programming. I don't know if Scott County would like that idea anymore, but we're certainly, we go with the three categories to the left and making sure that our good friends in Scott County are taken care of. I think that's great. I think it's a very, very bad policy decision to skip projects completely. I don't agree with that. I know that we did that a while back, but I don't think that's in the best interest of what we're trying to do. And talking about, and I appreciate Mr. Barnes him and his predecessor were just fantastic in working with us locals here and coming up with money. Our good friends at Anoka County, they just got that $40 million. I'm going to Shucky Darns because that means that now I didn't get my project at the federal level, but now not only that, were they competing with me there, they're out of the way on that one, but now they're going to compete with bonding money at the state, and who knows what we're going to do with that next time around with us folks. But we invest a lot of money, the counties do, and I see them all out there trying to get money for grants from the feds to do things, and I think that Mndot should, and they've been with us out there encouraging us to do that. And yes, we have a concern that they might not come through, but that's no reason to shut down the effort and chasing money. And some of us, that's all we do all the time. And I'd still like to operate like that if we could. And I just want to remind folks that I know Scott County and I believe Washington County and others certainly passed a 50-cent sales tax. And we got that seed money and we're spending it out here. And with our partners, Mndot, Department of Economic Development, and our locals with the city of Chaska, we have some wonderful, the TAB had helped. We had some wonderful partnerships on Highway 41 and other places in Chaska to make this money go further. So I think what we're doing is the right thing to do right now. And like I said, those three to the left and making sure our friends in Scott County are taken care of. We can talk about the amounts. Over programming has always been a discussion, doing it separately. I'm not necessarily against that, John. I think that's not a bad idea. So that's my 2 cents, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Thank you, Commissioner. Next is Commissioner Gattel and then Commissioner Ulrich. Just wanted a clarification from staff so that our members clearly understand that my understanding is that the regional highway category is the TAC suggested regional highway scenario. That requires some discussion too here because that's the category that would involve the shift. We made a decision last time to shift $5 million out of roadways into transit and into bike ped. And this would shift that money back. And what the consequence of that, Steve, you can explain more articulately, I think, but we'd end up, if we shift back, with 2 more spot mobility projects in Carver County and in Woodbury, I think, and then we would end up losing a dial ride program that would impact Plymouth, Minnetonka, and Maple Grove. Is that right?
Yes, Mr. Chair, thanks. I think you summed it up quite well. That recommendation, TAC didn't make a recommendation on one scenario or the next. They didn't vote on that, but they did recommend that TAB consider this as a new scenario. So that's maybe one clarification to make, that they didn't say this is a scenario that the committee wants you to approve. So yep.
Right, my mistake in spoken language. It's a new category they asked us to consider, but didn't necessarily endorse. All right, and back to Commissioner Gattell.
Thank you, and I appreciate this. This was really good. I really like seeing all these different funding scenarios. Let's just talk about what flexibility can happen. But I will say, when we look at what we're facing in here, the preference would be for the historical process scenarios, since it provides a modal balance and it stays near a midpoint. I think the problem maybe with some of the bigger project scenarios is that we could fund fewer projects overall the region, and the scenario may also reduce the potential for federal funding for some projects. So that's a concern. Over-programming, strongly support over-programming. It's been successful in managing, the federal funds, as it's somewhat common to award projects to be withdrawn for other reasons or scope changes or other things that happen. But I think we need to keep in mind, too, what the future is going to bring. For all of us as counties, our roads and bridges are our most critical right now, I think, with over 40% of them, at least in Hennepin County, being 50 years of service life. And I think I last year brought some of my other sister counties numbers on bridges that were nearing 50 years or lifespans of roads. With reduced state aid fund, that's going to happen. We know this is happening. We really should focus on the most critical asset needs. We really need to be keeping that in mind. So again, that's why I really support the historical process. Right, and most of our roadways and our projects right now, we have bikes and trails. So the last scenario, the scenario around bikes and trails, I would not be necessarily favorable on that right now, especially with everything coming down the economies. And I think all of us are looking at our roads and going, where are we going to pick and choose of which ones are going to have to be put off that really need to be done? And so that's why it kind of brings me back to the scenario we have. I also think we had a robust conversation a year ago about funding BRT, and there are so many great projects, but we also know that if we fund all those BRTs, it knocks so many good other programs out, and making a choice of funding, fewer of them allows us to get more projects in, but it also spreads it geographically if you look at that. So those are some of my comments about this and why I'm kind of going back to the historical. So
all right, you're favoring the inclusion of the historical as one of the scenarios that we contemplate. Did you have any other opinions on which other two we ought to be contemplating, or which other one we ought to be contemplating?
No, not really. I think I'd let some of my other colleagues comment further on that. I mean, I think we don't necessarily grade on the bike one. That one I would take out, and then the bigger projects we're concerned about the federal funding and match. So those would be 2 that I would take out. So that gets us down to 4.
Now we're to Commissioner Ulrich and then Commissioner McGuire.
Yeah, I just had a couple of smaller comments. There was a mention of the partial funding for Scott County under that $10 million project. We're still going to have to come up with $14 million. And I think one thing that Commissioner Maluchnik alluded to, I wanted to highlight, when we adopted the transportation sales tax, I think Mndot was almost shocked that all the projects on that list were Mndot projects. I mean, we've been bringing about $9-10 million a year to Mndot, mostly Mndot projects to help the region along. We just completed a 16941 interchange project. I think we brought like $21 or $22 million to the table on that from Scott County. So I'm hoping that when we consider over programming, that we fully fund the Scott County project.
And do you have any thoughts on the funding scenarios that ought to be advanced for further discussion in November and December?
Well, I favored the three that Washington County put forward or suggested, but I'm more concerned about how there's only one scenario, the green, is in which we get funded. So I would say that if we get funded through over programming, it takes the pressure off to choose that just to fund us, So.
All right. Okay, Commissioner McGuire.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And well, this is an interesting conversation. I really appreciate these scenarios. So we're leaning toward, we would like to see more projects in bike and ped because we know that's where public comment goes. We know that that's following the values that we have as a county, and also that we know Met Council has their objectives. And so I would like to see the more projects and bike and ped come through, and I would be open to the next ones that go through, but we'd like to see those can still stay in for consideration, because that's what we're focusing on. We know there's bike and ped in these other projects, but we know that that's still got to be a huge focus for us.
All right, thank you, Commissioner McGuire. Just a heads up here, folks. I want to just comment that we're over time, and some of us other places we have to be at 3. I'm looking at Mayor Washi and thinking we got to be in another meeting at 3. Everybody else does too, probably. So let's go for about another 8-10 minutes, till about 10:02, and then we'll sign off, and everybody can go back to thinking. Mayor Washi.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just glad there's others that can pick up at 3 o'clock if we can't get there right on time. But I just want to remind this group that how we got to that historical process and begin with was a long, well thought out, well articulated. We started with a subgroup to formulate around, what changes do we want to make from the last regional solicitation, and part of that, a key part of that was like dedicating, all right, we're going to take $25 million and dedicate that to an ABRT line. And what are the cascading ramifications on agreeing to do that? So there was the concern about, if we're doing ABRT on 25 million, we're going to spend a lot of money if we dedicate more than 7 million for other BRT projects, and lets other good projects get laid by the wayside that could score very, very well. So we put in that $7 million cap on other BRT projects. And as kind of what I'd call compensation or to try and keep some balance, because we are supporting a BRT line, we made the decision. And I remember that meeting. It was a lot of discussion happened. But this body ended up saying, all right, we're going to take 4 million from roads and 1 million from pedestrian and bikes and put it into the transit category to try and keep that whole. And so I'm in favor of, keeping on that historical process. We've had long discussions, well articulated discussions and debate on that. But that's where we really ended up. And while I appreciate some of these other scenarios, I want to look at them closer, but I think we should continue to stick with historical. Regarding over programming, I think there was a lot of good points made, especially regarding Scott County. I just want to take a closer look at those and consider all those other comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Mayor, will you cover for me in case we go a little bit longer when you jump over to the other meeting?
I will do that.
All right.
We'll always cover for you.
Let's see. It was, I think, Member Dugan and then Member Hollinshead.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. From my viewpoint, as I mentioned earlier, I worry about mission and mission creep, but I also think I support particularly Mayor Washi's comments on the historical process, because that honors the blind scoring system, which has been put into place and is, again, from watching the scoring scenario, meetings, from observing them, they are they are quite diligent, and the people that make up the TAC are pretty bright people. I put them only second to the tab, and I do want to honor Councilmember Reich's comment in the executive committee about the scoring and staying true to that. So if I had to choose two, it would be the historical process and the bigger projects primarily. And with respect to Member Barnes, somehow I want to be cautiously optimistic that we'll get those matching funds through his ingenuity. We get a lot bigger bang for the buck, 439 million in each, the historical and the bigger, and in equity they are 8 and 9 out of 10. If we had to go to 3, then I would ask, Mr. Kowalski and Mr. Overick, we go with the regional highway. But in any event, in my opinion, every county should get a project. So I'm going against kind of what I said about the Mission Creek, but I think we have to figure out a way that Scott County is benefited this cycle.
All right, good. Thank you. And then it was Member Hollinshead, and then Member Barber.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to line up with those who have commented in favor of the historical option. I agree that we had a long and thorough and very productive process coming to that. And I think to change it now would be premature and a little bit arbitrary. I would also say that the big project scenario does not guarantee much. I'm speaking as a transit rep here. Does not guarantee much of anything for transit using those big project capacity facilities, unless you get a separate action from one of the transit agencies putting transit where that project is. So I would favor the bike ped, the historical first, and the less roadways, and then the bike ped. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Not the more projects, but the less road expansion.
The less road expansion. I favor that. Yes.
Okay. Thank you. All right. Member Barber.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So what I would recommend is 3 different ones to look at. I would say historical, to Mirwashi's point of that encapsulates a lot of what the work we did over the last year and a half to frame all of this up. I would also favor the looking at the bigger scenario. I think not only as a representative from Scott County, but also I think that's really important to have all the 7 counties represented in some way, shape, or form. But I'd also propose that we look at the more scenario. A lot of the conversation so far has been very county directed. We also have a number of cities, and the more scenario factors in some of their projects, especially to Commissioner McGuire's points of, having some of those bike and ped and smaller projects that get built in. So I would recommend historic, bigger, and the more scenario.
All right. We're getting a mixed bag of opinion here, which is good. Member Wright.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I certainly agree with the notion of the historical, how if you look at the outcomes, you can maybe judge it one way, but that notion that it embeds a lot of our previous work, I really do concur with that observation and would strongly favor that category for exploration, if not approval, because of that alone. Instead of maybe just picking my, what would be my other preferred approaches, one thought I have is, because we're actually not picking what we're going to do, we're just trying to eliminate, and by doing that, we're helping staff do their work, and then can present us more information so we can have deeper conversations for an ultimate selection. I would almost hope that we could pair, have the appropriate pair. So if we have the historical, to me, it'd be more interesting to have a pair, the other two be the pair of bigger or smaller, or less, or different modes, more emphasis on roads or more emphasis on pedestrian. Because there you have a real sort of apple-apple comparison and an orange-orange comparison, at least categorically, versus having a conversation about bigger projects and then maybe say bike ped just doesn't seem as fruitful of a juxtaposition in terms of the data that would be collected. Whereas the other create a real stark comparison for choice and real analysis that has a lot of maybe this or that components to the sort of sub elements of each analysis. So I just wanted to throw that into the conversation. What's the appropriate pairing to juxtapose for a real decision when it gets back to us, the data that the staff collects?
So your suggestion is that we stick with the historical process as one of the scenarios we analyze, but then make that distinction between, I'll call it bigger projects and more projects. To just have that distinction to kind of plumb out or drill down on in a little bit more detail. One question that I would ask the group before we adjourn is, I'm really concerned about us really thinking through and discussing as a group this scenario that the TAC suggested, a regional highway, which is something that we talked about last time. So now the TAC's requesting consideration of this, not recommendation, but consideration of this regional highway scenario that requires the shifting back of $5 million that we just shifted in the last solicitation. I think we need to know whether the TAB thinks that's a good idea to make that policy change again and shift it back, or might this be a scenario we can just quickly eliminate from consideration and stick with 3 others, but eliminate that one. That's another way of Member Reich's a variation of Member Reich's approach, I guess.
I would agree.
Mr. Chair, if I may.
Member Hollinshead?
Mr. Chair. Yeah, I would say that since that just happened the last cycle, that shift, it's too soon to shift it back. I think we need to prove that out.
Yeah. Did Commissioner Holberg have her hand up? I can't, or remember, Commissioner Malushnik.
Oh, just quick, I don't want to step on Commissioner Holberg, but it seems there's a lot of consistency or a lot of people that like the historic. I think we should go in that direction and then have our conversation about over-programming. I think that's the way it went last time, wasn't it, Mr.
Yes,
Chair?
it was.
And, you know, we have a lot of people. It's just extra conversation here, and I'm sorry for that, but you know, Commissioner McGuire and I and others go to the national conventions, and many of you others do too. And all I hear is good about what we have going in bike trails and pedestrians, no matter where I go in the country. And again, the point was made by Commissioner Urick that you know, we're building trails on these roads. We're just not building any without, you know, any roads without trails anymore. So, and I remember probably about 10 years ago asking, do we have numbers on that? Nobody seemed to, but we probably should start looking at that a little bit more depth. But I think we should just, you know, this is a lot of work when people, we have this at counties, I know the cities do too. If you can't make decisions and kind of drill this stuff down, then you got staff doing all kinds of running around and checking things out and not being effective in what they're trying to do. So I just think that we go historical and then, you know, like I said, drill it down on over-programming on a separate.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought too. Commissioner Holbert.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just back to where we were before your last question and some feedback on scenarios to consider. I think that sticking with the historical makes sense. Would not support using the 20 million in over-programming all in one category, but to use those dollars to help even out or mitigate any regional disparities after the traditional or historical programming model has been applied. Dakota County doesn't do particularly good in any of these, somewhere between 2 and 9% of total dollars. So I think that there may be more than one county that would need some mitigation of balance, if you will, under any scenario. And so to have that 20 million to do that makes sense. I'm just really, as I look at some of these projects on, you know, some of the historical situations with investments, particularly in transit. We're looking at mothballing North Star. They're putting up cement barricades at the Kenred, the Lakeville Park and Ride station. The ridership on the Red Line never even got close to ridership projections. You know, we've kind of had a scenario in some cases of build it and they will ride, and maybe that doesn't always come to be true. And given the volatility of transit and commuting and congestion, is any of that standard going to be applied, or do we just continue on this because it was in the plans, we're going to continue to do it?
Yeah. It's a good question for us to kind of ruminate on until our next meeting, I think.
Mr. Chair?
Fair inquiry, yes. Is that Mary?
Sanger?
Oh, Sue Sanger.
I actually had my hand up too.
Okay, let's go member Sanger.
Member Barber. Council member.
All right, member Sanger, then member Barber.
Okay, a couple of different points. First, I agree with getting rid of the scenario that was proposed by TAC. It does not work. I do think the historical one is one that we should definitely consider and perhaps work from as a base. And I would also tend to get rid of the one that's small projects. I would rather do some more significant projects. And in addition to that, I wanted to comment on Member Geisler's suggestion about moving the overprogramming money into trails and sidewalks. And I don't, much as I am a trail user myself, I don't really think that's a good idea. And the reason is that, as you pointed out earlier, many of the projects in roadway modernization are road diet projects that will allow room for more trails and more sidewalks. And so rather than just funding more trails, I'd rather fund the modernization projects that include the trails and sidewalks as part of, and so that it benefits both motorists and cyclists and pedestrians. And then finally, I would ask one thing, and I don't know if we can do this. This isn't a scenario question, but to the extent we give money to trails and sidewalks, I have been totally frustrated over the years that we give money to them, and then we can't use these trails for half the year because nobody goes out and plows them. So I am wondering if we could make a contingency on our grants for trails and sidewalks that the recipient jurisdiction needs to commit in writing that they will plow those trails during the winter. And if they won't do that, I don't think we should award the money.
I think we made that decision last time, and that we required that in the last solicitation, that they had to maintain them as part of their.
Including snow plowing?
Correct.
Yes.
Be kept open all year round.
Good, because it's not always happening. Thank you.
All right. Well, it seems like.
Mr. Chair, I don't think you can see me. That's
Mayor Mary, go ahead, Mary.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I really appreciate the conversation that we've had. It's been robust, and I think it's given a lot of food for thought. It was very similar to the conversation that we had when we made the decision for the 2018 or the last solicitation. And so I really think Member Hollins had mentioned that in terms of the historical perspective, we've only had one round on this. And I think what we did was so significant that we shouldn't just flip-flop. I would say stay with the historical, and also for us to give a real thoughtful consideration of how we do our over-programming. So that would be my 2 cents.
That's the Malushnik model, we'll call it. And member Wright.
For sure, it'll fail for sure, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, I certainly think we should put a lot of thought into how we do over programming. I know our previous debates were just about amounts of programming, and now we're talking about use. And so we certainly might want to have a multiple framework approach that's based on its own sort of subset of analyses versus saying, we will use it this way in the future, not knowing what that future is, what the mix of projects are, what the priorities might be, how Thrive 2040 gets modified, but having a framework for decision-making versus a predisposed outcome might be something for, this is more for staff actually, how they can frame it for us for our future deliberations on that point, but I think is an important one. I will have to say that as we're talking about trails, it's really great that recently projects do tend to include trails, bike trails and pedestrian accommodations in the larger road projects. But I have to say that that's a more recent phenomena, A. B, we have adjusted scoring to favor the inclusion of those, which I think is very positive. But I would say if we put up a map in terms of the system that we are responsible for building out or contributing to the build out of, the system that's most absent or non-present would be our trails and pedestrian. I mean, if we showed a map. And so there's just a lot of catch up to do with that category. B, I mean, again, I'm just assuming that, but I think previous staff presentations demonstrated that. So there's a lot of catch up there. The second thing I would say, it's one thing to say that we've implemented parts of projects through other projects and think that's building out a system. What we might be doing is creating a lot of gaps. A bicycle system means things are connected and you get from A to B versus here's a stretch, there's a stretch, project by project patchwork. So when you invest in the category, you're investing from a systems approach, not a project patchwork approach. So it's just something to keep in mind when we're sort of putting, oh, we take care of these other modes because, well, now they're being baked in of recent, of late. So I just wanted to stick up for that category and put it into a broader context as we deliberate.
All right, thank you. Commissioner Karwoski. You're on mute, Stan.
I'm hearing, I'm going to sign on to that Malushik model. I think some of my fellow elected go tell. I'm hearing from a lot of people across our region, hey, let's stick with the historical and then address the needs of Scott County with the over programming. And also I like that aspect of with any additional money on that 10% over programming, some of the regional equity. That way we can give staff a much narrow focus and put, you know, too many categories to kind of, let's get a little more focus. I like that.
Okay, Member Dugan.
I think Member Geisler had his hand up before me. Did you, Chris?
Oh, I missed it. So, yeah.
Geisler,
go ahead.
Just a quick comment to address the chair's question before. I agree with removing the TAC recommendation of the regional highway scenario. It's moving 3 projects around, and I don't find it materially different from the historical. I think that's a good one to remove for that process, and support all the other positive conversation of why historical is valuable. So that's why, honestly, why I base my analysis off of that. So that's the only reason that I wanted to throw it from the hopes of doing that. And I do believe from an over-programming perspective, we can address some of the other scenarios as we discussed. The one thing that I do wanted to mention about regional balance, I do have concerns about saying everybody gets a project every solicitation. When Scott County only submitted 5 projects and everyone else was 15 or more, it does start getting into the category of, well, if I really limit what I want to submit, I can make sure that I get my project. I'm not saying that that's the intent here, but I think that's an unintended consequence of making sure everybody gets funded. I would like us to really focus on regional balance over a period of time, the 2003 to now scenario versus a narrower or just the solicitation focus, in my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you, Member Geisler. And then back to Member Dugan.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate everybody's thoughts on the regional highway scenario, and Chris and Matt and Deb Barber, and and Kevin. I stand corrected that it's too wild. It's too much of a switch after we just spent all the time getting to the historical and the last summer's meeting. So I think that was a bad mistake on my part. To understand Commissioner Malushnik's proposal, is that we just have the historical, we send to the staff, we're selecting historical plus over programming, and all the other 5 are eliminated?
I think that's right. It's a love your staff model.
Okay. I do.
It's a love note to the staff at the Met Council.
Yeah, I think it makes great sense, but I also want to, Councilmember Wright's approach of if we do go with more, the bigger the bigger and the less, that contradiction, so that we could really dive in and see how that affects. And to Member Geisler, I did ask staff, I'm taking the liberty of asking them to, for the next meeting, to have an historical distribution by county, to your point.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting idea, because if we did that, if we did those two, if we did historical process plus more projects, you got 46 projects in historical, you got 56 in more projects. You got a total transportation investment that's about the same, at a little over 400 million. And at least it gives us something to compare to, and maybe you have some things to move around. So, and then you look at the over programming independently and figure out how you want to do that. And there's a lot of options there, including following the historical percentages there, making sure everybody gets something, looking at equity, all the things that have been mentioned here today about how to deal with that. But I think that's something that we could put off for November and December conversation as well. So what do folks think about that? If we go with historical, that's overwhelming in terms of its support, and then just go to the more projects, which has our highest number of projects. Look at those two for comparative purposes. Hold off the discussion until November on the over programming. Folks give that some thought, and then staff just has 2 models to work off of in terms of coming up with ideas for us. Commissioner Malushnik, you're giving us the thumbs up on the Malushnik model modified?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, your wisdom is just way beyond your years, sir. So I think you're heading us in the right direction, and the city of Edina is so darn lucky to have you as their mayor. So.
You are full of praise all the way around here. You throw a big one to the staff, and you're throwing me a bone, and you are really something else.
That staff, we can't keep taking them in circles. I'll tell you that right now.
Yeah, well, this will be good.
True, Randy.
Mayor Winchell.
Yeah, this has been probably the most informative session that I've had since I've been on, as far as really understanding the process. And I've sat and listened, and I've flipped through these charts multiple of times. I think that I like the approach that we're going to, taking the 1 or 2 projects, and then the overfunding. I think we just really look at any of the projects that sit on the bubble. Don't really make a commitment to anything, but look at anything that really sits on that bubble of, do we? And obviously, I agree with Member Geisler about Scott County. I had mentioned this in the executive board meeting, that they only submitted 5, and I looked at the other ones, and none of them were even close in the scoring. So I mean, obviously I go through that intersection a ton of times. I hate it, and if you really look at it, it's the only intersection left between Mankato and Minneapolis that's has lights at it at this point. So it's a very, very important intersection, and I hope that they get the funding. But I agree with Member Geisler that we got to be careful about just giving someone because they didn't do something, and we're only looking at this particular time. Historically, they may be way ahead of the curve now and just felt that, I don't know the reasoning behind it, but like I say, I'm not against Scott County getting that project, but I just think we got to be careful to say, obviously we always want to look at it regionally across, because I'm certain Carver County over the years has been there as I've looked back at the years. but I think it's just important that we can take that overfunding and just look at it where those projects are on the bubble, and if we can get that equity base out of the same thing, hey, we're all a winner out of that. That's what we're looking for.
Yeah, to your point, what we'll have for the next meeting is we'll have a historic analysis on this. This is the same issue we had with Anoka County, either the last solicitation or the one before that, where we had to look at it historically to see if they were sort of getting their fair share, so to speak. And I think with Scott County, you'll find historically they're right where they belong, but nonetheless, it's a discussion worth having and important to have, I think, when we're trying to get stuff done in the region. And then we can also look at these projects that you point out, Mayor, that are on the bubble in conjunction with analyzing everything else. Do we want to use some of that over programming money for more bike and ped and trail stuff, or take on a combination of bubble projects? We got all kinds of possibilities there in terms of how we could use that over programming money and use it safely.
Agreed.
So, all right. So here's what we'll do then. We'll go with historic process. We'll go with more projects, and then we'll have a conversation about over programming. And to Member Reich's point, I think he was one that made it. Let's ask staff to come up with some ideas for us in terms of how we could use those over program funds.
Mayor?
Yes, Member Sanger.
I'm one last thing. I'm fine with the approach, but I would like to make one additional request with the approach, which is that in going back to all the comments that were received from the public about trying to minimize roadway expansion, could the analysis also include what would happen with what was here, I think of number 5, the scenario number 5, less expansion, to see what that would do to modifying the mix of projects we could fund instead.
Well, I think, you've raised an issue that we've always taken on, and that is, as we get close to the end, there can be a hybrid here, and we can look back at some of the other scenarios we decided not to drill down on in depth and see if we want to move some things around. So I think we can still accomplish that over the next 2 months as we look at these things and try to figure out where we want to settle in as a group on the projects we're going to fund. Okay. I think one of the really good things about this whole conversation is that, and the scenarios that we've got, is that we got every functional classification covered. So we don't have that conversation this time like we've had in the past. So that's out of the way. And then we can just figure out how to use this money that's coming to the region. So great conversation today. And thank you so much for being actively involved and thinking through all of these things. Mayor Bailey had a comment here. I was just going through the chat one more time before we signed off, and I think we're safe. If anybody has a question or a comment, go ahead and speak up. It's hard to see everybody on the screen. So Mayor Bailey, thanks for your comment in the chat room. All right, we're staff. You were conspicuously, you're down to 2.
Yeah, that's great news from our standpoint. I think we brought it together the last half an hour here, so we appreciate that. And next steps for us is tomorrow's funding and programming meeting is to pass on some of the feedback we've received here today. Really focus in on the over programming as some different options there. And I think we can get some technical feedback on different ways we could bring that back to you. So thanks for the good discussion today.
As I mentioned, when we meet in November, we'll have all that historic data from 03 on how the dollars align with the population.
Yes, we will.
Density. So thanks everybody. That was a great conversation.
Good meeting. See y'all.
All right.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.
Bye everybody.
Bye. Thank you, Jim.